At the Tri-County Auto Salvage Auction in Columbus, Ohio, Isaac Hartwell raised his hand and bought 17 cars nobody wanted, all of them for $2,500. Laughter swept the room. The loudest came from Giselle Vance, CEO of Heartline Motors, standing near the press section with a smile sharp as cut glass. "You just bought $2,500 worth of scrap metal," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hope you kept the number for the nearest junkyard." A phone camera caught every second of it. Isaac signed the paperwork and walked to his truck without a single word. He knew something no one else in that room knew. 30 days later, Giselle Vance would drive herself to find him. What was hidden inside those 17 cars? Stay with this story. The ending is something nobody saw coming. The Tri-County Auto Salvage Auction ran 4 times a year in a converted warehouse on the eastern edge of Columbus. Most of the regulars were small-time dealers looking for project cars, a few collectors chasing long shots, and the occasional mechanic who could tell a good frame from a bad one just by crouching down and looking. Isaac Hartwell had been attending for 3 years. He always came alone, always arrived early, and always wore the same faded green flannel shirt that made him look like he belonged more in someone's backyard than at a bidding floor. His truck was a 2004 model with a cracked passenger mirror and a tailgate that didn't close all the way. He had no assistant, no business card, no company name on the side of his door. To anyone watching, he was exactly what he looked like, a single man with a small budget and no particular plan. But Isaac had been tracking Lot 17 for 6 weeks, not casually, methodically. He had requested the full vehicle identification list from the auction house 4 days after the lot was posted, cross-referenced every number against production records stored in 2 binders his late father had left behind in a storage unit in Dayton, and driven out to the lot on a Tuesday morning when the facility was quiet to walk between the black vehicles with a flashlight and a notepad. Most people who glanced at those 17 cars saw rust, broken glass, stripped interiors, missing engines, and decades of accumulated neglect. Isaac saw a different set of facts entirely. 3 of the 17 cars carried specific identifiers that the auction listing had not bothered to mention, because the people who prepared those listings were not looking for what he was looking for. Car number 7 was a 1967 Ford Mustang Boss 302. The exterior was a disaster, layers of blistered paint, a collapsed front quarter panel, no seats, no glass in the rear. But Isaac had taken a wire brush to the firewall on his Tuesday visit and found the vehicle identification number stamped into the original metal, clean and unaltered. The number matched a production sequence that corresponded to fewer than 200 vehicles ever built. In the collector market, a verified Boss 302 in any restaurable condition was worth somewhere between $40,000 and $55,000 when the work was done right. Car number 12 was a 1969 Pontiac GTO with a missing engine but a body that had somehow survived decades in a dry storage facility before ending up in an Indiana estate sale. The chrome trim was intact, the floor pans were solid, and the original color code was still readable on the door jamb. A matching replacement engine was available through 3 different parts networks Isaac had dealt with for years. Restored, it would bring $30,000 to $35,000. Those 2 cars alone justified the price of the entire lot several times over. But it was car number 3 that Isaac kept returning to. It sat at the far end of the row, half buried under a collapsed tarpaulin, so corroded and shapeless that 2 different dealers had walked past it without stopping. He had noticed it only because of the roofline, a particular geometry that matched a set of photographs in one of his father's binders. Carter Hartwell had been a restoration engineer for nearly 30 years before his death, a man who had worked on hundreds of significant American vehicles and kept notes on all of them. One entry from 1991 described tracking a prototype vehicle from the defunct Callahan Motor Company, a 1971 V8 development chassis that had been the sole surviving physical record of a proprietary engine series Callahan had been developing before the company folded in 1973. Carter's notes described the car as likely destroyed, but also listed a frame identifier that would make it unmistakable if it ever surfaced. Isaac had crouched under car number 3 with his flashlight for 4 minutes before he found the stamp in the mud-caked chassis rail. Cal V8 71 P01. He photographed it, stood up, brushed his knees clean, and walked back to his truck. He did not tell anyone, he did not call anyone. He drove home, ate dinner, put his daughter Maya to bed, and spent 2 hours at the kitchen table reviewing his notes before going to sleep. He had $2,800 in his checking account. He would offer $2,500 and keep the rest for fuel and equipment. The morning of the auction, his phone rang while he was loading chain equipment into the truck bed. It was Connor Walsh, his closest friend and occasional second pair of hands in the garage. Connor had helped Isaac move cars for years and knew better than to ask unnecessary questions. But even he had doubts. "You're actually doing this," he said. Isaac said he was. "Those cars are wrecks, man. I've seen them," Isaac said he knew. "And you're putting in almost everything you have." Isaac said that was correct. There was a pause on the line. "All right," Connor said finally. "Call me when you need help hauling." Isaac closed the tailgate as well as it would go and drove toward the warehouse. On his left wrist, as always, was his father's watch, a mechanical piece that had stopped running sometime in the winter of 2012 and that Isaac had never sent out for repair. He wore it anyway. Some things you keep not because they work, but because of what they represent. Giselle Vance arrived at the Tri-County warehouse 40 minutes into the registration period, flanked by Adrian Cole, Heartline Motors' chief legal counsel, and a small cluster of journalists from 2 automotive industry publications. She wore a navy blazer over a white shirt and moved through the room in the particular way that people move when they are accustomed to being the most important person present, not aggressively, just with a settled certainty that the space would accommodate them. At 28, Giselle was the youngest chief executive in Heartline's 30-year history. The company operated in the upper mid-tier of vehicle commerce, high-end used inventory, curated auctions, fleet consulting for corporate clients, and under her leadership in the preceding 2 years, revenue had grown significantly. A Forbes profile 3 months earlier had described her as a precision instrument in a blunt force industry. She had kept the article framed on the wall behind her desk, not out of vanity but as a reminder of the standard she had set for herself. Her purpose at the Tri-County auction was specific and limited. Heartline was preparing a showroom display of restored American classics for an upcoming industry event in the fall, and her acquisitions team had flagged 2 vehicles in the current inventory as candidates for purchase. Neither was in Lot 17. She had no interest in Lot 17. She was aware of it the way anyone in the room was aware of it, as the pile of unsellable vehicles that would probably go for scrap value if anyone bought it at all. When she first noticed Isaac, he was crouching beside one of the cars in the lot, his back to the room, running his hand along the base of a door panel. She registered him the way an experienced professional registers irrelevant information, briefly, categorically without retention, flannel shirt, old truck in the lot, solo bidder at a salvage lot. Not a factor. She moved on toward the registration desk and did not think about him again until the bidding on Lot 17 began. The lot came up midway through the session. The auctioneer's assistant read out a summary description: 17 vehicles, mixed years. Mixed condition, no running engines confirmed. Sold as is with no title guarantees on 4 of the units. The opening bid was set at $500. The room was quiet. A few people glanced over without raising their paddles. Isaac raised his without hesitation and said clearly, $2,500. The auctioneer confirmed it. A beat passed. No competing bid came. Another beat. Going once, the auctioneer said. The room stayed still. Going twice, a few heads turned toward Isaac. Some people smiled. Sold. The gavel came down. The laughter started at the edges and spread inward. It was not cruel. Exactly. More the reflexive amusement of people watching someone do something they collectively agreed was foolish. Giselle was standing near the press area when it happened, and something in the moment, the camera pointed at her, the journalists nearby. The easy target of a man in a worn flannel shirt with a bad truck, $2,500 pile of wreckage, pulled a response from her that she would later have difficulty fully accounting for. She said it with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being quoted. He just bought $2,500 worth of scrap metal. Hope he kept the number for the nearest junkyard. The people around her laughed. One of the journalists smiled. The phone camera was already rolling. Isaac heard it. He was 4 rows away, signing the purchase confirmation with the auction clerk. He heard the words and he heard the laughter, and he turned his head and looked directly at Giselle Vance for approximately 3 seconds. His expression did not change. He did not flush, did not square his shoulders, did not open his mouth. He gave a single, unhurried nod in her general direction, not agreement, not submission, just the smallest acknowledgement that he had heard, and then turned back to the clerk and finished signing. The clerk handed him his copies. Isaac folded them into his shirt pocket, picked up the chain equipment he had left near the door, and walked out to his truck. The camera footage ended there, with the crowd still chuckling and Isaac's back already disappearing through the door. The clip was 40 seconds long. By midnight it had accumulated tens of thousands of views, most of them under some version of the same caption. Single dad spends life savings on 17 junk cars, gets roasted by CEO. Giselle's name was in the title of most of them. She saw them before she went to sleep that night. Several people on her team had sent the links with laughing reactions. She responded to none of them and set her phone face down on the nightstand. It felt like the end of the story. It was not the end of the story. Isaac spent the next 2 days with Connor, moving all 17 vehicles to a rented garage space in an industrial lot 8 miles east of downtown Columbus. The building was wide, metal-roofed, and cheap, with enough floor space to park all 17 cars in 2 rows with room to walk between them. Connor helped run the tow chain and back the hauler and said very little until the last car was inside and the overhead lights were on. Then he stood in the middle of the garage with his arms folded and looked at the rows of ruined vehicles, doors hanging off, windshields shattered, frames pocked with corrosion, and said, "This is a lot of junk." Isaac was already crouching beside car number 3, not responding. "I'm not being negative," Connor said. "I'm just describing what I see." Isaac stood up and looked at the row. "You're describing what's visible," he said. "That's different from what's there." He handed Connor a clipboard with a numbered inspection chart and told him to start at the far end. They worked through the list systematically over the following 4 days. Isaac applied the same method his father had taught him. No assumptions, no shortcuts. Full inventory before any decision about priority. He began with the vehicles he expected the least from, working outward toward the ones he knew mattered. Each car got a full walk-around, a floor pan inspection, a check of the VIN plate and any visible identification markings, and a notation in the clipboard chart. Isaac worked in silence. Connor worked alongside him and asked questions when he had them, and Isaac answered without condescension, the way someone answers when they genuinely believe the other person is capable of understanding the full answer. Most of the 17 cars confirmed what the auction listing had implied. Some were worth parting out. Some had usable chassis components. A few had specific hardware that smaller restoration shops would pay for. He noted each one and set his estimates. Then he reached car number 7. He worked the grime off the firewall with a solvent cloth and a wire brush, uncovered the stamped number, photographed it, and called a collector in Detroit named Marcus who had been hunting a verified Boss 302 for 3 years. Marcus called back within 20 minutes. His voice was controlled but not quite steady. He asked twice if Isaac was certain about the stamp. Isaac read the number aloud both times. Marcus said he could come down by the weekend and asked what Isaac needed to get it to him. They discussed terms after the call. Isaac sat for a moment on an overturned bucket and did a rough calculation on a notepad. Just the Mustang alone, he circled the number. Car number 12 took longer. The engine cavity was empty and had been for some time, but when Isaac opened the door and inspected the data plate on the door jamb, the original color code and production sequence were readable. He took measurements of the floor pans, knocked on the inner sills, checked the firewall mounting points. The structure was solid. He had a contact in St. Louis who dealt in period-correct replacement engines for exactly this model year, a man who maintained a private inventory and who did not advertise publicly. Isaac sent him a message with the specifications. The reply came that evening. The engine was available. Delivery within 10 days. The cost was manageable against the projected resale margin. He added car number 12 to his priority column. And then there was car number 3. Isaac waited until Connor had gone home before he uncovered it fully. He worked the crusted mud off the chassis rail with a stiff brush and a slow application of solvent, not rushing, not forcing. The stamp emerged letter by letter out of the muck. Cal V871 P01. He pressed his thumb against the cold metal to confirm the depth of the impression. It was original. He took a fresh set of photographs with his phone, then opened his laptop and pulled up a scanned file of his father's engineering notes, pages typed, and handwritten and annotated across 3 decades of work. The entry about the Callahan V8 prototype was 12 pages long. Carter Hartwell had first encountered references to the vehicle in 1988 while working on a related documentation project for a private collector. He had traced the production records through 2 acquisitions and 1 company dissolution, eventually concluding that the physical vehicle had most likely been lost in a facility disposal in Indiana sometime in the late 1980s. But he had also written in his careful, unhurried handwriting at the bottom of the last page, "If the chassis survived, it will carry Cal V871P01. That stamp is the only proof of its identity that cannot be fabricated." Isaac read that line twice. He closed the laptop. He sat in the garage for a while without moving. He did not make any calls that night. He set the alarm for 5:30, drove home, and went to sleep. By the end of the first week, the rough calculations on Isaac's notepad had grown into a full projection table. Even being conservative, assuming problems with the replacement engine delivery, assuming lower than expected prices on the 12 secondary vehicles, assuming no unusual demand, the numbers were well above $200,000. If the Mustang came in as expected, if the GTO restoration held its estimate, and if the Callahan represented even a fraction of what Isaac suspected it might be worth to the right buyer, the total picture was something he had not allowed himself to think about until it was written down in front of him. He sat with the numbers for a long time, then he folded the paper in half, put it in the binder with his father's notes, and went back to work. What Isaac did not know, had no reason to know, was that inside the offices of Heartline Motors on the other side of Columbus, a file had been open for 8 months with his car's name on it. Heartline was 18 months into a $200 million federal lawsuit against Legacy Engine Group, a mid-sized powertrain manufacturer based in Michigan. The core of the case was a claim of derivative design theft. Heartline's legal team argued that the foundational architecture of Legacy's current commercial V8 engine family had been lifted, without authorization, from a proprietary prototype design that Heartline had acquired through a chain of corporate mergers stretching back to the early 1980s, a chain that included, at its origin point, the intellectual property portfolio of the Callahan Motor Company, dissolved in 1973. The prototype in question was the 1971 Callahan V8 development chassis. Adrian Cole had assembled a documentary case that was substantial but not definitive. Legacy's legal team had introduced sufficient ambiguity into the paper trail to keep the judge uncertain, and the central hearing was now 47 days away. What Heartline needed to resolve that ambiguity was physical evidence, a material artifact bearing the original Callahan development markings, something that could not be dismissed as a document reproduction or a chain of custody assumption. What they needed specifically was the chassis. And for 8 months, Adrian Cole had believed the chassis did not exist. He had traced the vehicle through 6 states and 3 private collection sales, eventually arriving at a disposal manifest from an Indiana facility dated 1989. The manifest listed a 1971 prototype frame under a partial identifier that matched the Callahan records closely enough to satisfy his research team. He had presented this to Giselle as a closed finding. The physical evidence avenue was exhausted. They would proceed on documentary grounds and accept the elevated risk. Giselle had read the memo, asked 3 precise questions, received 3 precise answers, and moved on. The file stayed open only in the technical sense. It had never been formally closed because the case itself was ongoing. The night after the auction, Adrian had gone home, set his bag down, poured a glass of water, and turned on the television. The clip appeared on his feed before he reached the remote. He watched it once, he watched it again, he did not laugh. He stared at the thumbnail image frozen at the clip's end, the parking lot, the hauler, the 2 rows of wrecked vehicles being lined up near Isaac's truck. In the background of the thumbnail, car number 3 was partially visible. Its specific roofline geometry, the particular proportion of the windshield rake, the shape of the engine hood. Adrian had spent 8 months looking at photographs of the Callahan prototype. His threshold for recognition was lower than most people's. He closed the clip, opened a different application, and pulled up the original vehicle photographs from Carter Hartwell's archived records that his research team had been using as reference material. He looked at the roofline in the archive photo. He looked at the roofline in the thumbnail. He closed the application, went to his kitchen, and stood there for approximately 2 minutes doing nothing. Then he went to his home office, opened the auction house website, and navigated to the Lot 17 listing. Car number 3 was described as 1971 V8 prototype. Unidentified manufacturer, frame and body only. He read it twice. He found the chassis dimension specifications that the listing agent had entered as standard fields. They matched. He did not sleep well that night. In the morning, Adrian arrived at Heartline's offices before Giselle and pulled up the full auction records to confirm the buyer information. He called the technical director at 7:15. Does the Callahan V8 chassis carry a frame identifier? What prefix does it use? The answer came back within 3 minutes, Cal V871. Adrian thanked him and ended the call. He printed a single page from the auction records, walked down the hall to Giselle's office, and set it on her desk when she arrived. "We have a problem," he said. She read the page. The room was quiet for a long time. Then she said flatly, "Find me his contact information." The first approach was clumsy, and Isaac recognized it immediately. On the 10th day after the auction, 2 men arrived at the garage wearing clothes that were slightly too new and asking questions about parts sourcing with the specific inexpertise of people who had been briefed on what to ask but did not actually know the subject. One of them kept glancing toward the covered shape at the back of the garage. Isaac answered their questions with complete courtesy and zero information. He confirmed that he was not currently selling anything from the lot. He thanked them for stopping by. He watched them back out of the driveway and told Connor, who was buffing the Mustang's driver's side panel, "They'll send someone with more authority in about 3 days." Connor looked up. "Heartline?" Isaac nodded. "So they found out about the Callahan." Isaac said it was a reasonable assumption. Connor said, "You're not worried?" Isaac thought about this for a moment. "About what exactly?" he said, and went back to work. While the legal positioning was happening across town, Isaac's actual work was producing results. He had prioritized 7 vehicles from the secondary group for rapid processing. 2 of them required only mechanical cleaning and minor bodywork and were sold within the first 10 days to a local dealer who ran a small lot on the west side. 3 others went through the forum network Connor had posted to, a community of dedicated collectors who valued verified provenance over cosmetic presentation. The forum post was simple: a few photographs, the work completed, the asking price. No storytelling, no sales language, the responses came quickly. The quality of the work was not what forum members expected from the story they had been following, and they had been following it. The clip had circulated in the collector community alongside commentary from people who actually understood what it meant to pull a viable chassis from a salvage lot. The reaction there was different from the general reaction. Several experienced collectors had watched the clip and said, privately and then publicly, that the man in the flannel shirt had known exactly what he was doing. Connor's forum posts were the confirmation. The photographs showed work that was meticulous and unhurried, the kind of restoration that prioritized accuracy over speed, that replaced what needed replacing and preserved what did not, that treated the original engineering of the vehicle as something worth respecting rather than something to be concealed under fresh paint. Several collectors responded in the thread to say they had assumed the clip was the whole story and were now revising that assumption. A few asked if there was additional inventory available. Connor replied that updates would be posted as work was completed. The thread kept growing. By day 14, the total cash received from the lot was $18,500. By day 18, it was pushing $26,000 as the Mustang sale with Marcus from Detroit was finalized. Collector drove down, spent 40 minutes with the car, made 3 phone calls to verify the identification number through his own network, and then wrote a check. The number on the check was $48,000. Isaac deposited it at the branch on Henderson Road, drove home, sat at the kitchen table, and looked at the balance on his phone screen for a while. Then he made a grocery list. The second Heartline approach came on day 21. Not intermediaries this time, Giselle herself. Alone, arriving at the garage just after 2 in the afternoon in a gray sedan that she had driven herself. She parked outside, stood at the open bay door for a moment taking in the interior, and then walked in. Isaac was under the Pontiac GTO on a rolling creeper. He heard the footsteps and the change in ambient sound and slid out from under the car without hurry. He saw her, registered her, stood and wiped his hands on a shop cloth. If he was surprised, he did not show it. "I wondered when you'd come yourself," he said. It was a statement, not a challenge. Giselle had prepared for a negotiation. She had a number in mind, a position to open from, a set of responses mapped to the various directions the conversation might go. She was very good at negotiations. What she had not prepared for was standing in a working garage and looking at 9 restored or in-progress vehicles arranged in careful rows, each one representing a level of craft that had nothing to do with her assumptions about the man who had bought them. She took a moment longer than she intended before speaking. "We're interested in purchasing car number 3, she said. $15,000 transferred today. Isaac looked at her without expression. "No," he said. She adjusted. 50,000. He said no again with the same flat simplicity, as though they were discussing the weather. She recalibrated. This was not a man holding out for a higher number. She tried a different approach. "What do you know about it?" she asked. He crossed the garage floor to where the Callahan sat under its tarpaulin, folded back one edge, and shone a work light on the chassis rail. The identifier stamp was fully visible in the light, clean, deep, unmistakable, Cal V871P01. He held the light steady and looked at her face while she read it. "I know it's the only one," he said. She was quiet for several seconds. "Why won't you sell?" she asked. Her voice had shifted. The executive register was still there, but something underneath it had changed texture. Isaac covered the car again and turned to face her. "Because I know what it's worth to Heartline Motors specifically," he said. "And you know I know." She left without agreeing to anything. It was the first time in several years she had walked away from a meeting without controlling its outcome, and the feeling stayed with her on the drive back. The next 4 days involved escalating pressure from both sides. Adrian sent a formal written offer to Isaac through a courier, $75,000, structured with specific conditions around timeline and transfer documentation. 2 days after that, a different letter arrived, this one on legal letterhead, citing language about Isaac's property being potentially subject to evidentiary considerations in pending litigation. Isaac took both letters to a local attorney named Wallace, who spent 20 minutes reviewing them and then told Isaac that the evidentiary language in the second letter was, in his professional opinion, a bluff. The vehicle had been legitimately purchased at a public auction and no court order existed or had been applied for. Isaac owned the car. He was under no obligation to sell, cooperate, or respond. Isaac thanked him, paid his consultation fee, and drove back to the garage. What he did next surprised Connor, who had been quietly watching the pressure accumulate for days. Isaac called Adrian Cole's direct number, which he had found on the Heartline corporate website. Adrian answered on the second ring. Isaac identified himself and then said, without preamble, "I want you to tell your CEO something." The other side, Legacy, made contact through an intermediary 3 days ago. They offered me $180,000 to make the car unavailable before the hearing. I turned it down. I'm telling you this because you should know the landscape you're operating in. I won't be selling to Legacy and I won't be helping them, but I'm not going to be pressured into selling to Heartline either. Adrian was silent for long, enough that Isaac wondered if the line had dropped. Then Adrian said slowly, "Why are you telling me this instead of keeping it as leverage?" Isaac said. "Because I'm not interested in winning by letting someone else lose in a way that's worse than necessary." Another silence. "I'll relay this to Ms. Vance," Adrian said. Isaac said thank you and ended the call. The Mustang auction on day 28 generated coverage that Isaac had not anticipated and would not have sought. He had brought the car to a small collector event at a venue in the Short North neighborhood, kind of event where 50 or 60 people who knew what they were looking at could evaluate the work properly. 3 journalists who had been tracking the lot story from the beginning were present, either by chance or by following the forum activity. When the Mustang sold for $52,000 to a collector from Chicago who had been on the phone with Marcus from Detroit the night before, The room reacted in a way that a room full of people who understood the significance would react, with the specific quiet appreciation of people seeing a thing done correctly. The journalists posted their accounts within hours. The numbers in the coverage were accurate. A verified Boss 302 fully restored, sold for $52,000 from a lot purchased entirely for $2,500 by a man who had been publicly mocked for buying it. The story did not require embellishment. The math spoke in plain language. By day 28, 15 of the 17 vehicles had been sold or were committed. Isaac's total receipts from the lot, calculated on the workbench notepad that had replaced the kitchen table projections, stood at $183,000. 2 cars remained. The Pontiac GTO was 3 days from completion. The Callahan sat at the back of the garage, covered, untouched since Isaac had shown it to Giselle. Giselle read the coverage from her office with the hearing 19 days away and the projection from Adrian sitting on her desk showing a best-case probability of 42% without physical evidence. She turned her chair toward the window and looked at the Columbus skyline for a while. Then she asked her assistant to find an open slot in her afternoon. She came back to the garage on day 29 in the early evening. Just as the last light was going flat outside the bay doors, she was not wearing the blazer. She had left Adrian at the office. She stood in the doorway with both hands in the pockets of her jacket and said, when Isaac looked up from the GTO, "I need to talk to you honestly." Not as a negotiation. He put the socket wrench down and looked at her for a moment. Then he gestured toward the 2 folding chairs near the workbench and said, "All right." She told him everything. Not the executive summary she had been delivering to investors and board members, but the actual shape of it, the 8 months of searching, the documentary case that was almost strong enough but not quite, the hearing in 19 days, what a loss would mean for Heartline's core IP portfolio and for the people who had built their careers around it. She told him that the car represented something his father had also understood to be significant, which was not a manipulative observation but simply an honest one. And then she said, "What do I need to offer you?" Isaac leaned back in his chair. He was quiet for long enough that the ambient noise of the industrial lot, a distant forklift, a loading dock, traffic on the overpass became audible in the pause. Then he said, "Do you want to know why I bought that lot?" She said she did. He did not tell her the full story, but he told her the parts that mattered, the binders, the notes, his father's handwriting at the bottom of 12 pages of research, the watch on his wrist that still had his father's fingerprint worn into the crown from 30 years of winding. He was not asking for sympathy. He was answering a question with information that was true. $95,000 for the car, he said. She began to respond and he continued. And one condition that has nothing to do with the money. Heartline Motors funds a vocational training program in classic auto restoration at Columbus Trades. $50,000 per year for 3 years. No press release required, no naming rights, no association with me, just the program running, teaching people who want to learn the work. Giselle looked at him for a moment that was longer than most of their previous exchanges. She had negotiated with people worth hundreds of millions of dollars and had never heard a condition structured exactly this way, not toward personal recognition, not toward reciprocal business advantage, simply toward a thing continuing to exist. "Why not ask for a public apology?" she said. "You're owed one." Isaac thought about this. "I don't need that," he said. "You don't owe me the words. I think you already know you were wrong." "You knew it before tonight." Something in Giselle's face changed, not dramatically, not with any particular visible emotion, just a shift in the quality of how she was holding the expression. "Yes," she said. "I knew." She extended her hand across the space between the 2 folding chairs. Isaac shook it once. Connor, who had been working quietly at the far end of the garage and had heard most of it, served as one witness. Adrian, who Giselle called and who drove over within the hour, served as the other. The agreement was written out by hand. Both parties signed 2 copies and Adrian took one. It was 10:47 at night. Isaac made coffee. Connor made a comment about the absurdity of the situation and everyone in the garage laughed, briefly and genuinely, the way people laugh when something very strange has resolved itself into something very simple. The Callahan V8 chassis was documented, transported, and introduced as material evidence at the federal hearing 16 days later. The frame identifier, the production markings, and the provenance chain that Adrian's team had reconstructed from the auction records and Carter Hartwell's archived materials proved sufficient to resolve the documentary ambiguity that Legacy's legal team had been exploiting. The judge ruled in Hartline's favor. Legacy Engine Group was ordered to cease commercial production of the disputed engine variant and to enter remediation proceedings on the revenue already generated. The case would continue in its compensation phase for some time, but the core determination, the one that Hartline had been trying to establish for 2 years, was settled. Giselle heard the ruling in the courtroom, said very little afterward, and declined the celebratory dinner her team had arranged for the evening. She drove home alone. When a journalist asked her about the car story, 3 weeks after the ruling, in the context of a longer profile about the litigation outcome, she gave an answer that her publicist had not reviewed and her communications team had not been consulted on. "I made an inaccurate assessment," she said, "not about the value of the cars. About the value of the person standing next to them. Those aren't the same kind of mistake, but I made both of them at the same time." She did not elaborate, and the journalist did not push. The quote ran in the article without her name on the pull quotation, which was how she preferred it. The Columbus Trades vocational program launched 6 weeks after the agreement was signed, with 12 enrolled students in its first cohort. The curriculum was built around documentation, disassembly, structural evaluation, and period-correct restoration, not the cosmetic shortcut version but the full technical practice. Isaac visited twice during the first semester at the coordinator's invitation, not as a guest speaker and not to take any formal role, but simply to walk through the shop and answer questions from students who wanted to know specific things. He answered them the same way his father had answered him, directly, without simplification, assuming the person asking could handle the full truth of the answer. The Pontiac GTO was the last vehicle from Lot 17 that Isaac worked on. He completed it 4 days after the hearing concluded, rolled it out of the garage into the morning light, and stood beside it for a long time. The color was a deep metallic blue with chrome trim that caught the October light in a particular way, long and clean along the hood line. He had repainted it in the original factory specification, not because it was more valuable that way, but because he had found, in one of his father's binders, a photograph from 1974. Carter Hartwell standing beside a car of exactly this color and this year in a driveway that Isaac did not recognize, squinting against the sun, with the particular expression of a man who is very satisfied with a piece of work he has just finished. Isaac had looked at that photograph a great many times in his life. He had never thought he would have a reason to look at it and then look up and see the same car in front of him. He did not try to explain what that felt like even to Connor, who had been with him for the whole of it. Some things do not require narration. By the end of the 30th day after the auction at Tri-County, Isaac's total receipts from Lot 17, including the sale of the Callahan chassis to Hartline, were $278,000, from a purchase of $2,500. He used a portion to sign a long-term lease on the garage, buy out the equipment he had been renting, and register a business name with the state. Hartwell Restoration. He had business cards printed for the first time in his adult life. He put them in a small stack on the corner of the workbench, next to the coffee maker, next to his father's binders, and left them there for whoever might need one. The GTO he did not sell. He pushed it to the back corner of the garage where it was visible from the main working area. That specific blue, that specific chrome, the hood line exactly right in the fluorescent light. On the corner of the windshield dashboard, where the defroster grid met the glass, he set his father's watch face up, the cracked crystal, the stopped hands, the worn crown. Not repaired, not hidden. Just present, the way the important things always are, if you know how to look. End.